The ledger hit the counter with a sound like a gunshot, and Alice Garrison did not flinch. She had ridden 43 miles through red dust and rattlesnake country to stand in this general store, and she would not let her hands shake now. Not in front of him. Not in front of Calvin Hawkins, who was staring at her from across the counter with those dark, unreadable eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. "I know what my father owed you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Every dollar, every cent. I have it written right there in his hand." Calvin did not look at the ledger, he looked at her. She had expected anger. She had braced for it across every mile of that long ride, had rehearsed responses to his fury, his accusations, his contempt. What she had not prepared for was silence. What she had not prepared for was the way he simply studied her, like a man reading something written in a language he had not seen in a very long time. "Your father is dead," he said finally. His voice was quiet, low, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry weight. "3 weeks ago," Alice said. "Yes." "And you rode out here alone." "I did. From Amarillo. From what is left of Amarillo, yes." She pushed the ledger closer to him. "He owed you $420. He took a loan when the drought hit in 1878. He never paid it back. He always said he would. He never did." She swallowed the grief that rose in her throat like floodwater and forced it back down. There was no room for grief in this transaction. "I cannot pay you in cash. I do not have it, but I can work. I can cook, I can keep books, I can manage a store, I can do laundry, I can do whatever honest work you have that needs doing. I will stay until the debt is cleared. That is why I am here." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Calvin Hawkins leaned back against the shelf behind him, arms crossed, and something moved behind his eyes that Alice could not name. It was not cruelty, it was not pity. It was something older and more complicated than either of those things. "Alice Garrison," he said slowly, as though testing the name against something in his memory. "Yes, Thomas Garrison's daughter. His only child." Another silence. Then Calvin reached across the counter, picked up the ledger, and opened it. He read it slowly, thoroughly, with the careful attention of a man who had learned long ago that the details hidden in the margins were always the most important part. Alice watched his face and found nothing in it she could read. Then he closed the ledger and set it back down. "Your father was a good man," Calvin said. "He was unlucky and he was proud and he could not ask for help the right way, but he was a good man." Alice felt something crack inside her chest, just slightly, just enough. "He was." Calvin was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I forgave this debt 2 years ago." The words landed on Alice like cold water thrown from a bucket. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon." 2 years ago," Calvin repeated, his voice entirely even. "After the second drought, I went through my books and I forgave it. I wrote it off. Your father did not know because I never told him. And I never told him because I knew he would argue with me about it, and I did not have the patience for that argument." He paused. "I am sorry you rode 43 miles for a debt that does not exist." Alice opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The speech she had prepared, the careful, dignified arrangement of words she had constructed and rehearsed across 43 miles of red dust, all of it simply fell apart. She felt the ground shifting under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the worn floorboards of the store. "You cannot do that," she said. "You cannot simply forgive a debt without." "It is my debt to forgive," Calvin said. "I do what I like with my own accounts. That is $420. I am aware of the amount. That is not a small sum. That is not a Miss Garrison." His voice was gentle but firm. "The debt is forgiven. It was forgiven before your father died. You do not owe me anything. You are free to ride back to Amarillo." She should have felt relief. That was the logical, sensible response: relief, gratitude, a polite farewell, and a long ride home. Instead, Alice felt something that she would only understand later, much later, when the whole complicated truth of this moment had unwound itself into clarity. What she felt was a strange, terrifying sense of displacement, because Amarillo was not home anymore. Amarillo was an empty house and a grave she was not yet ready to stand at alone. She looked at Calvin Hawkins and she said, because the truth had a way of coming out of her before she could stop it, "I have nowhere to go back to." The quiet that followed that admission was a different kind of quiet entirely. Calvin uncrossed his arms. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw him taking in what she had probably tried very hard to hide. The dust on her riding coat, the shadows under her eyes from too many nights of bad sleep on the trail. The way she was holding herself with the brittle, careful posture of a person who has been holding themselves together by sheer willpower for weeks and is beginning to tire of the effort. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you some water." That was how it began. Not with a transaction, not with an exchange, but with a glass of water in a general store in Crestfall, Texas, in the spring of 1880, and the kind of honesty that only comes out when a person is too exhausted to pretend. Crestfall was not a large town. It occupied a bend in a narrow river called the Crestfall Creek, which was not impressive enough to be called a river by any serious measurement, but the locals had decided to call it one anyway. The town had a general store, a livery stable, a doctor's office that was also the telegraph office, a saloon, a church that had been without a pastor for 8 months, and a scattering of houses and farms on the surrounding land. It had about 340 permanent residents, though that number shifted with the seasons and the weather and the various fortunes of the ranching families who lived in the outlying areas. Calvin Hawkins had owned the general store for 6 years. He had come to Crestfall in 1874 at the age of 27, which made him 33 now, with a seriousness about him that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and that was, in fact, something more like depth. He had come from Tennessee, from a family that had been broken apart by the war and its aftermath, and he had come west because that was what a man did when the place he came from had been reduced to ash and hard memory. He had bought the store from the widow of the previous owner, one Henry Marsh, who had died of a fever and left behind a decently stocked inventory and a set of well-maintained ledgers. Calvin had maintained the ledgers with equal care and had expanded the inventory over time. He was not a hard man, though he had been tested by hard things. He kept fair prices and he extended credit to families who needed it during the lean seasons, and he was known, though he would never have used this word himself, as honest. He had never married. He had come close once, but that was a story he kept in the locked drawer of his own memory and did not take out for public view. Alice Garrison was 26 years old, and she had come to Crestfall carrying everything she owned in 2 saddlebags, and a grief so fresh it still had edges that cut. Her father, Thomas Garrison, had been a farmer who had tried and failed to make a life in the Panhandle, had moved several times, had struggled with the brutal rhythms of drought and flood that governed life in that part of Texas, and had died in March of 1880 of a heart that had simply given out. Alice had buried him, settled his affairs as best she could, sold the horse and wagon and what remained of the household goods, and ridden south on the one horse she kept, a bay mare named Clara, with the ledger her father had left her, and a purpose that had kept her moving when nothing else would have. She had not cried yet. She would not let herself cry yet. She did not entirely understand why. She only knew that there was something she needed to do first, and that thing was to settle what her father owed, and that once it was settled she might find out what came after. What came after, it turned out, was a glass of well water in Calvin Hawkins's general store and a conversation that lasted until the evening light turned the windows orange. He asked her questions without making them feel like interrogation. Where had she come from? What her father had grown? Whether she had family elsewhere? She answered him honestly, which surprised her, because she was not usually someone who spoke easily to strangers. She had no family elsewhere. She had an aunt in Louisiana who had not answered a letter in 3 years. She had no one else. "What are you good at?" Calvin asked. He was sitting on a barrel across from the counter now, and the store was quiet around them, the last of the afternoon customers long gone. "I can read and write and do figures," she said. "I kept my father's accounts from the time I was 14. I can cook reasonably well, and I can preserve, and I can keep a house. I can ride, which you have seen. I can handle a rifle when I have to. I learned some doctoring from a woman in Amarillo who knew what she was doing. She paused. I am good at working hard. Calvin looked at her steadily. I could use someone to help in the store, he said. Not to repay a debt. There is no debt. I need the help because I have been managing alone since February, when the boy I had helping me left to go work on the Henderson ranch. He paused. I will pay you a wage, a fair one. 40 cents a day plus your board, which means the room above the store that I am not currently using for anything. Alice looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment with the careful attention she brought to all important decisions. You are doing this because you feel sorry for me, she said. I am doing this because I need the help, he said. If it happens to solve two problems at once, I do not see why that should be a problem. There was something direct and uncomplicated about the way he said it that made it feel true. Alice Garrison had developed, over a lifetime of managing difficult circumstances, a very good instinct for when she was being lied to. She did not feel that instinct now. I will work for a trial period of 1 month, she said. If we find at the end of that month that it is not working, I will go. She extended her hand across the counter. Those are my terms. Calvin stood, crossed the space between them, and shook her hand. His grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly the right amount of time. Agreed, he said. She moved into the room above the store that evening. It was a small room with a low ceiling and a window that looked out over the main street, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a chest of drawers and a hook behind the door. It was sparse, but it was clean, and after weeks of riding and sleeping rough on the trail, it felt like more than she had any right to ask for. She stood at the window for a while in the last of the light and watched the street below. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself she would stay 1 month, perhaps 2, save enough money to figure out what came next. She told herself she had not ridden 43 miles to be given charity, even comfortable charity, and that she would earn every cent of what she was paid. She did not tell herself anything about Calvin Hawkins because there was nothing to tell. He was her employer. The arrangement was practical and clear. There was nothing else to consider. She believed that for approximately 3 weeks. The first day she worked in the store, she made 3 mistakes. She gave the wrong change to Mrs. Delia Pryor, one of the ranching wives from the western edge of town, and had to recount it twice in front of her. She misread the label on a tin of baking powder as cream of tartar and nearly sold it to old Mr. Briggs for the wrong purpose. And she knocked over a display of tin cups that Calvin had arranged near the front window, sending them rattling across the floor in a clatter that brought 3 heads turning in the street outside. She cleaned up the cups in silence and rearranged them in the same order they had been, which she had memorized from when she first saw them. Calvin watched her do this from across the room and said nothing. He did not say anything about any of the 3 mistakes, which was both a relief and, in some strange way that she could not entirely account for, more disconcerting than being corrected would have been. By the end of the first week, she had made no more significant mistakes. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the dry goods section in a way that reduced the time it took to locate items by roughly half, had started keeping a secondary ledger that tracked which goods sold fastest by day of the week and which sat on the shelf, and had repaired the hinge on the back storage room door that had been sticking for what appeared, based on the wear pattern of the frame, to be at least a year. Calvin noticed all of this. She knew he noticed because she caught him looking at the reorganized shelves with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but somewhere in the middle. He said, "The shelves look good," in a matter-of-fact tone, and she said, "Thank you," in an equally matter-of-fact tone, and that was that. But the truth was that working alongside him was different from what she had expected. She had expected him to be distant, managerial, the way employers were. He was not like that. He worked with her rather than directing her from a remove, lifting and carrying and cleaning and stocking alongside her. He made decisions quickly and without fuss. He was patient with difficult customers in a way that struck her as genuine rather than performed. When a family came in, a man named Elias Wheeler, his wife, and 4 children who clearly could not afford what they had come in to buy, Calvin went through their order and made the prices add up to less than they should have by a series of small, barely visible adjustments that Alice, who was watching the ledger, noticed at once. He did not make a show of it. He wrote the total in the book and took the money and said good morning to them as they left. Alice did not say anything about it that day. But that evening, after the store was closed and they were doing the end-of-day accounting at the counter together, she said, "You charged Elias Wheeler 60 cents less than the listed price on 4 items." Calvin did not look up from the ledger. "The listed price on those 4 items is sometimes flexible. You change the price based on who is buying. I change it based on what I can reasonably absorb without running at a loss," he said. "The Wheelers have had a rough season. They are not the only ones. There are 3 other families I do the same for. It is not charity. I do not call it charity, and I do not tell them I am doing it, because they would refuse it if you did." He looked up at that. Their eyes met across the ledger. "Yes," he said. She looked down at the numbers again. "Your margins are already very thin," she said. "I know my margins. You are going to have trouble come December if the Henderson Ranch does not increase their orders. Are you lecturing me about the operation of my own store? I am pointing out what the numbers show," she said calmly. "You can do with that information whatever you choose." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a faint note of something in his voice that she would later identify as the first small fragment of something other than professional regard, "You are better at figures than I expected." "I told you I was," she said. "You did," he agreed. That was the night she stayed late working on a full reconciliation of the accounts, cross-referencing his 2 ledgers with the receipt book, finding and correcting 3 errors that had been compounding for 4 months. She was still at it when Calvin came back from his supper and found her at the counter with 2 lanterns burning, surrounded by papers. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You should eat something," he said. "I am nearly done." He went to the back room and came back with a plate covered with a cloth and set it on the counter beside her. He had brought her food from the boarding house kitchen where he took his meals. She had not asked him to. She had not expected him to. She finished the reconciliation, ate the food while it was still warm, and went up to her room. She lay in the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the town settling for the night, a horse somewhere, the distant murmur from the saloon, the creak of the building. And she felt something inside her that she was not quite ready to examine. Something that had to do with a plate of food set down quietly beside her without comment, without expectation, without any requirement that she acknowledge it as anything other than what it was. She thought about her father, who had also been a man who did things without making a production of them. She thought about the way grief works, how it is not always loud, how sometimes it sits in the body quietly and shows itself in the strangest moments, in things completely unrelated to the person you have lost. She did not cry. She was not ready yet, but she felt, for the first time since his death, something that was not entirely pain. The 3rd week brought a problem that had nothing to do with the store. A man rode into Crestfall on a Thursday morning, tied his horse to the rail outside the saloon, and had not left by Friday evening. His name was Cord Mallory, and Alice knew him. She had known him from Amarillo, from the years before. He was not a man she had any desire to see again, and the reasons for that were locked in the part of her history that she had not yet opened to anyone in Crestfall. She saw him on the main street on Friday afternoon through the store window and felt the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. She stepped back from the window immediately, which was foolish, and she knew it was foolish because he had not been looking at the store, had not seen her. But the fear was instinctive, older than reason, trained into her by the particular events of 3 years ago. She went back to stocking shelves and said nothing. Saturday morning, Cord Mallory walked into the general store. He had not changed much. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that was handsome in a way that obscured, until you knew him, the character behind it. He wore a decent coat and a hat that cost more than it should have, and the kind of easy smile that Alice had once, to her shame, found disarming. He looked around the store with the leisurely interest of someone who has no particular errand, and then his eyes found her behind the counter. The smile did not change. That was the worst of it. The smile did not change. "Well," he said, "Alice Garrison." She kept her face entirely still. "Can I help you with something?" "I did not know you were here," he said, moving toward the counter. "What a thing. Last I heard you were in Amarillo." "Last I heard Amarillo was not your concern," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were behind the counter and she was pressing them flat against the wood to keep them still. He leaned an arm on the counter. "Now, Alice, that is not a friendly way to talk." "I am not feeling particularly friendly," she said. "What can I get you?" "I need some supplies. Flour, salt, coffee." He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, comfortable, unhurried, the expression of a man who is accustomed to being tolerated, because he is difficult to get rid of. "I am riding through. Going down to San Antonio. Just stop to rest for a few days." "I will get your order," she said. She went about filling it with her back to him, measuring and wrapping, and she was in the process of calculating the price when Calvin came in from the back room carrying a crate of tinned goods. He set it down, looked at the customer, and gave the same brief professional nod he gave everyone. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Cord said pleasantly. "You the owner?" "I am." "Nice place." "Good to see things running properly." He glanced back at Alice. "Your girl here is doing fine work." The use of the phrase "your girl" was calculated. Alice knew it was calculated. She kept her eyes on the counter. Calvin looked at Cord Mallory for a moment with an expression that was perfectly neutral. "Is everything in order?" he asked Alice. "Yes," she said. "That will be 42 cents. Cord paid and gathered his goods and left. The bell above the door announced his departure with its small, cheerful sound, which seemed entirely wrong for the occasion. Calvin was still standing by the crate of tins. He did not ask her anything. He watched her for a moment, and then he picked up the crate and went back to work. She was grateful for that, deeply and without reservation. She was grateful in the way that you are grateful for something you did not know you needed until you had it. That evening, however, something happened that made the situation considerably more complicated. Cord Mallory did not leave Crestfall on Saturday. He did not leave on Sunday. By Monday morning, it was apparent that his plan to ride through had either changed or had never been genuine. And Alice was sitting with the tight, watchful discomfort of a person who knows a storm is building and cannot see yet from which direction it will arrive. She was doing inventory in the back room on Monday afternoon when she heard the bell above the door, and then, through the thin wall, the sound of Cord Mallory's voice and Calvin's voice, and then, after a moment, a shift in the quality of Calvin's voice that made her set down her clipboard and come to the doorway. Cord was at the counter. He was not buying anything. He was talking to Calvin in a confidential tone, leaning forward slightly in the way that men do when they want to present themselves as sharing something valuable. "I just thought, as a courtesy," Cord was saying, "that you ought to know something about the woman working for you." Calvin was behind the counter. His expression was unreadable. He said nothing. "She has a dark past," Cord said. The phrase was precise and deliberate and clearly chosen. "Back in Amarillo, there were questions about her character, about some money that went missing from a business where she was employed. I'm not saying she is a thief. I'm just saying a man in your position with accounts to keep ought to know the questions that were asked." The silence that followed was absolute. Alice stepped out of the back room doorway. "You need to leave," she said. Both men turned. Cord looked at her with that same unchanged smile. Calvin looked at her with something different, something alert and still, like a man listening very carefully. "Alice," Cord said, in the reasonable tone of someone addressing an unreasonable person. "I am only, you know exactly what you are doing," she said. Her voice shook slightly and she hated it for that. "And you know exactly why I do not want you here. And you know that what you just told him is a lie constructed from a situation you made happen." She looked at Calvin. My former employer in Amarillo lost $40 from his office in the spring of 1877. Cord Mallory was the one who took it. He tried to shift the blame to me. I left the position before it could be proven because I did not have the means to fight it. She turned back to Cord. If you have any business in this store, state it now. If you do not, get out. The silence after that was a different kind of entirely. Cord looked at her for a moment, and she saw something shift in his eyes, the realization that she was not going to be managed, not here, not in front of a witness, not in a place where she was standing on something solid. The calculation changed. The smile contracted slightly. "Just being neighborly," he said, and picked up his hat from the counter where he had set it. "No offense meant." He left. The bell rang. Alice did not move until she heard his boots cross the boardwalk outside and recede. Then she turned to Calvin because there was nothing else to do. "I am sorry you heard that," she said. "You do not need to apologize for his behavior," Calvin said. He was completely calm. "What I want to know is whether he is likely to cause you more trouble." She considered this. "I do not know why he is still in town. He was never a man who did things without a reason. Do you owe him anything? Is there anything between you?" "No," she said. The word was flat and final. "There is nothing between us. There never was anything between us that I consented to. He is someone who was in my life for a period I would rather forget and who apparently cannot resist the opportunity to remind me of it." Calvin looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. It was not an all right that meant the subject was dropped. It was an all right that meant he had heard her and was treating what she said as the truth. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. "I should tell you the whole story," she said, because she could see that he deserved it, that he was holding the information she had given him carefully and not jumping to conclusions, and that this courtesy deserved a full answer. "Not here. After closing, if you are willing." "I will be here," he said. That evening, after the last customer had gone and they had closed the shutters and done the accounts, they sat on either side of the counter in the lamplight, and Alice told him everything. She told him about the family she had gone to work for in Amarillo at the age of 23, after her father's second crop failure, because they needed the money and she needed the work. She told him about Cord Mallory, who was a business associate of her employer, who had arrived with easy charm and then with something harder underneath. She told him about the way he had pursued her despite her being clear that she was not interested, about the way he had seemed at the time, harmless enough to manage. She told him how badly she had misjudged that. She told him about the stolen money and the way Cord had arranged it, the way the story had settled around her before she could stop it, the way she had left because she had no money for a lawyer and no family in the city to vouch for her character. She told him about going back to her father after that, about the next 3 years of trying to rebuild something from what remained. Calvin listened without interrupting. He did not interject. He did not try to offer comfort or frame the events for her or restate them back to her in a way that revised her understanding. He simply listened, and when she was done, he said, "He is going to be angry that you did not react the way he expected today. I know. He may try something else. I know. I will talk to Ed Doran." Ed Doran was Crestfall's sheriff, a competent man of middle age who Calvin trusted. Not to accuse Mallory of anything, but to make sure there is someone paying attention. Alice looked at him across the counter. In the lamplight, his face was serious and focused, turned toward the problem the way a man turns toward something that needs doing. She felt something she had been carefully not feeling begin to move in her chest, like water finding a crack in a dam. "You do not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I do not have to do it." She looked down at the ledger that was still open between them, at the columns of numbers that represented flour and salt and coffee, and all the small necessary things that kept people alive in this country. She thought about what it meant to have someone handle a threat the way he was handling it, not dramatically, not performatively, but practically and quietly, and with the clear implication that she was worth the effort. She did not say anything about that. Not then, but she felt it. Cord Mallory did leave Crestfall 3 days later, on a Thursday morning. She watched from the window as he rode south. She did not know whether it was Calvin's conversation with Ed Doran that had prompted him, or simply the end of whatever errand he had invented. She did not care enough to find out. He was gone, and that was sufficient. The month she had promised to work became 2 months without either of them acknowledging the transition. May gave way to June, and June brought heat so thorough and complete that the air above the main street shimmered, and the creek dropped to a trickle. Alice found herself falling into the rhythms of the store with a naturalness that surprised her. She knew where everything was. She knew the regular customers by name and often by errand before they stated it. Mrs. Pryor always needed the same things in the same proportions. Old Mr. Briggs came in for his tobacco on Fridays. The Hernandez family from the South Road came once a month and needed their credit extended, and never asked for it outright, but the oldest daughter, Maria, always stood close to the barrel of hard candy near the door in a way that broke Alice's heart. Alice started setting aside a small paper twist of candy for Maria each month visit, paid for from her own wages, and leaving it on the counter where the girl could take it without it being remarked on. She did not tell Calvin she was doing this. He saw it anyway. He said nothing about it, but one month he added a second paper twist to the one she had left on the counter, and when the Hernandez family came in, both of them were there. She noticed that. She stored it away in the place in her heart where she was beginning to store things about Calvin Hawkins, in the careful, almost reluctant way that a person stores things they are not sure they are allowed to have. The thing about falling in love in the middle of grief is that it catches you off guard every time, because you are already accustomed to feeling things you did not expect. Alice had been managing the interior weather of loss for 3 months, the surprise of it, the way it showed up without warning in the middle of unrelated moments, the way a particular quality of evening light or the smell of something familiar could suddenly make the whole fact of her father's absence hit her like something physical. She was used to being ambushed by feeling. So when the ambush came in a different form, she was slow to recognize it. It came in small things. The way Calvin stood beside her when they were working in the same small space, close enough that she was always faintly aware of him, but maintaining a distance that was respectful and precise. The way he listened when she talked, which was the rarest of qualities. The way he handled problems with a steady pragmatism that she found, increasingly, deeply attractive, because she was herself a person who handled problems practically, and she had not understood until now how it would feel to see that quality reflected back at her. She noticed that he laughed rarely but genuinely, and that when he did, it changed his face in a way that made her want to do whatever she had done to cause it again. She noticed that he read. He had a shelf of books in the back room, history and natural science, and one volume of poetry that was much more worn than the others, and she cataloged this information without quite knowing why. She noticed that he treated every person who came through the door of the store with the same basic courtesy regardless of their circumstances, which was not as common a quality as it should have been. She noticed these things, and she told herself she was noticing them in the way that you notice anything about a person you spend 8 hours a day with in close quarters. She told herself there was nothing more to it. She told herself this with decreasing conviction as June became July. The moment she stopped being able to tell herself that it all came on a Tuesday evening when they were working late to prepare for the quarterly supply order, which was the largest single piece of paper logistics the store required. They needed to forecast for the autumn and early winter, which meant going through the sales records from the past year and building a picture of what Crestfall would need between October and December. They had been at it for 2 hours. The store was dark except for the lamps on the counter, and the town outside had gone quiet. They were working well together, Alice calling numbers, Calvin writing them down and checking them against the previous year's figures, and there was a quality of comfort in it, a settled companionableness that felt like something Alice had not had in her life in a very long time and had not known she was missing. At some point, she was reading a figure aloud and realized he had not written it. She looked up. He was looking at her. It was not a new thing for him to look at her, but this was different. This was the look of a man who has been holding something back for a significant period of time, and whose capacity for holding it back has simply run out. He was looking at her with a directness and a clarity that made the breath go out of her entirely. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "Calvin," and she heard her own voice come out different, softer, with less of the professional shell she had been maintaining for 2 months. He said, "I am trying to be appropriate," she said. "I know. You work for me," he said, "and you came here under circumstances that I do not want to take advantage of." "I am aware of my circumstances," she said. "I am not confused about them." He was quiet. There was something deliberate and careful about the way he was choosing his words, the way he was making sure he was saying the right thing rather than the easy thing. She found this, in a way she could not have entirely articulated, the most compelling thing about him. "I have thought about this," he said. "I have thought about it since approximately the 3rd week. I have not said anything because I could not figure out how to say it in a way that did not sound like I was using the situation." "You are not using anything," she said. "You forgave the debt before I arrived. You paid me a fair wage from the first day. You have never asked me for anything." She paused. "I notice things, Calvin. I have been noticing things about you for 2 months, and I know the difference between a man who sees an opportunity and a man who..." She stopped. "Who what?" he said. She looked at him across the counter, across the papers and the ledger and the carefully organized evidence of all the practical work they had been doing together, and she said, "Who has a good heart, who has been trying not to show it because he thinks it makes him easier to take advantage of." He was very still. "Your father was the same way," she said, and then wondered if that was the right thing to say, but he did not look hurt. He looked like she had named something he had not expected anyone to name. "He was," he said. "Yes." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are both pausing to be sure they want to go forward. "I do not know what comes next," Alice said honestly. "I am still figuring out what my life looks like. I came here with a purpose, and the purpose was taken away, and I am still..." She paused. "I am still in the middle of working out what is real and what is not." "I understand that," Calvin said. "But this is real," she said, and she was not sure herself entirely what she meant by this. The evening, the lamplight, the way he was looking at her, the way she felt sitting in this store in this town that she had arrived in as a stranger and had somehow begun to feel was the place where something good might happen. All of that. She meant all of that. Calvin reached across the counter and placed his hand over hers, very gently, the way you set down something valuable. His hand was warm and calloused, and she felt the contact from her hand all the way up through her arm and into her chest where the grief had been living. They stayed like that for a moment. That was all. Then they went back to the supply order, because the supply order needed doing. But something had changed between them that made the work feel entirely different, that made the whole room feel warmer and more full of meaning than any room she had been in since before her father died. She cried that night, finally, alone in her small room above the store. She cried for a long time, quietly, with her face in the pillow so no one would hear. She cried for her father, and for the years of struggling, and for the long ride through the red dust with the ledger in her saddlebag, and all the weight of what she thought she owed. She cried for the relief of finding out the debt was forgiven, which she had not let herself fully feel until now. She cried for the small, stubborn tenderness she felt for the man in the store below, which was frightening in the specific way that all real things are frightening. She cried until there was nothing left in her but a clean, empty quiet. Then she slept better than she had since March. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically, not with any sudden shift in the structure of the days. They still worked side by side. They still kept the accounts and stocked the shelves and served the customers and argued, occasionally, productively, about inventory choices. But there was a quality to the time now that was more honest. He would find reasons to stand near her. She would find reasons to look for him when he was in the back room. They talked in the evenings after closing, the way people talk when they are learning each other's stories exchanged, questions asked, the gradual construction of a shared picture of who the other person was before they arrived in this particular moment. She learned about Tennessee, about his father, who had been a farmer and a fair man, and his brother, who had died in the last year of the war at the age of 19. About the years after, when the family had scattered into the difficult geography of survival, and about his decision to go west. He did not speak of his brother without a grief that was old and settled and present all at once, and she recognized that grief the way you recognize the face of a stranger you have somehow always known. She sat beside it with him in the evenings and did not try to fix it, because she understood now that grief does not want to be fixed, it wants to be witnessed. He learned about her childhood in the Panhandle, which had been spare but not loveless, about her mother, who had died when Alice was 11, about the way she had learned to run a household before she was old enough to understand that other children did not have to do what she did, about the strange, fierce education she had given herself from whatever books and newspapers she could get her hands on, because her father could not afford regular schooling, but believed in knowing things and had made sure she was always reading something. About the 3 years of trying to hold things together in Amarillo and the bitterness of the situation with Cord Mallory, and the way she had packed her father's ledger into her saddlebag in March and ridden south with a purpose, because having a purpose was the only thing she could think of to keep moving. Calvin listened to all of it. He listened in the way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, completely, attentively, with the kind of presence that made you feel that what you were saying was important and that the person receiving it was keeping it carefully. In August, something else happened. Something that felt small at the time but would matter later in a way Alice could not have predicted. A woman named Rosa Hernandez, the mother of young Maria, wife of the farmer who came in monthly, came into the store on a Wednesday morning without her husband and without the children. She came in alone and stood at the counter and looked at Alice with an expression that was both direct and slightly embarrassed. "I need something that I do not want to ask for in front of my husband," Rosa said. Her English was careful and deliberate, and Alice listened carefully in return. "All right," Alice said. "What do you need?" It turned out that Rosa needed to know about the doctor. Not for herself, she was quick to say, but for a situation she did not fully explain, and Alice understood without needing. It explained that there was a neighbor woman in a difficult situation, and Rosa was trying to find the most discreet path to help. Alice told her what she knew about Dr. Amos Cole, who was both the doctor and the telegraph operator, who was a careful and respectful man. She told her what times he was likely to be available without a crowd. She told her what she would expect from him in terms of privacy. Rosa thanked her and left. The next week she came back with her family for the monthly order, and she looked at Alice across the counter with a quiet recognition and said, in a low voice under the noise of her children, "It helped. Thank you." Alice nodded once. That was all. When Rosa's family had gone, Calvin came out from the back room where he had been doing inventory. He had not been in the store during the first conversation, but he had been there for the second, and he had heard enough to understand the shape of it. He looked at Alice. "You are good with people," he said. "I have had to be," she said. "There is a difference," he said, "between being good with people because you have to be and being good with people because you care about what happens to them." She looked at him. She felt the words land somewhere real. "Both can be true at once," she said. "Yes," he said. "Both can be true at once." The summer passed in this way, full of small and significant things, and Alice stopped counting the weeks against a departure that was becoming less and less real to her. She was not leaving at the end of August. She knew that. She was not sure she would leave at all, and the knowledge of that was both frightening and something that felt very much like belonging. September came, and with it the early preparations for winter. Calvin rode out to several of the ranching families to take advance orders, which he did every year, and for the first time he asked Alice if she wanted to come. She said yes. They rode together across the dry grass in the early September light, side by side on their horses, and there was an ease to riding alongside him that she recognized from the store, the sense of working in the same direction with someone who matched her pace. At the last ranch they visited, a place called the Dunbar Spread run by an older couple named James and Elspeth Dunbar, Elspeth sat them both down in her kitchen for coffee and cornbread and looked at them across the table with the interested eyes of a woman who has seen enough of life to read a situation quickly. "How long have you two been together?" Elspeth asked, with the directness of advanced age and no patience for prevarication. There was a small silence. Alice felt the blood rise in her face in a way she had not felt since she was 16. Calvin said, "We work together. Miss Garrison helps me at the store." "That is not what I asked," Elspeth said pleasantly. She looked at Alice. "Young woman, how long?" Alice met the old woman's eyes and felt something resolve inside her, some last small resistance like a lock turning over. "We have been working together since April," she said. "Everything else is," she hesitated. "New," Calvin said. He was looking at Alice, not at Elspeth. "It is new." "New things are good," Elspeth said firmly and poured them both more coffee. On the ride back in the long, reddening afternoon light, they rode slower than necessary. Alice was looking at the horizon and thinking about new things and about what it meant that she had felt so right, so simply and squarely right, sitting in that kitchen beside him. She said, "I want to stay." The words came out before she had decided to say them. She felt the air change beside her as his horse checked slightly. In crestfall, he asked. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay here. I do not want to leave at the end of the trial period or any other period." She paused. "I am telling you this because I think you should know, and because I do not want to be in a position where I am staying without knowing whether." She stopped. "Whether I want you to," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead at the road. Then he said, "Alice, I have been trying to figure out how to ask you not to leave since about the second month." He paused. "I have been trying to find a reason you would accept. I reorganized the back room specifically so there would be more work to justify keeping you on." She turned to look at him. The evening light was in his face, and he was looking at her with that directness he had, the unwillingness to look away from true things. "You reorganized the back room to create work," she said. "I did. Calvin Hawkins." She could not help the small, startled sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something more complicated than a laugh. That is both the most practical and the most ridiculous, I know," he said. He was not quite smiling, but it was close. "I am aware of how it sounds." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "You do not need a reason. I want to stay. That is the only reason that matters." He pulled his horse to a stop. She stopped beside him. They were in the middle of the road in the last of the September light, with the town visible in the distance and the sky above them going from orange to deep blue at the edges. He reached across the distance between them and took her hand the way he had taken it in the store, with the same deliberate care, and this time neither of them went back to work. "Stay," he said. It was not a request decorated with any particular circumstance or condition. It was simply the word, direct and full, the way he did everything. "I will," she said. They stayed there for a long moment with their horses stopped side by side and their hands joined in the fading light, and Alice felt the last of the armor she had been carrying since March settle off her shoulders like something that had done its job and was now no longer needed. They rode back into town in the dark, companionably and without urgency, and the town looked different to her from how it had looked when she arrived in April. It looked like hers. It looked like the place she was going to build something from. October was beautiful that year, which was not always the case in that part of Texas. The heat broke in the first week, and the days became clear and cool, with a brightness to the air that felt like a reward for having survived the summer. Business at the store picked up as families came in for their winter preparations, and Alice was busy in a way she found satisfying rather than exhausting, the busyness of a person doing work that has meaning in a place that has value. She and Calvin had found a way of being together that was both careful and genuine. They were not careless with it. They moved from friendship into something more by degrees, with the same steady attention they brought to everything else. He took her to supper at the boarding house on a Friday evening, which was a small thing in itself but very public, and Crestfall was a small town, and that mattered. She met the people in his life, Ed Doran and his wife Margaret, who were sharp and kind, and immediately took to Alice with the warmth of people who had been hoping Calvin would find something good. The Dunbars, who came to town for church once a month, and who seemed deeply satisfied by what they saw when they saw Alice and Calvin in the same space. She wrote a letter to her aunt in Louisiana. She did not know if it would be answered. But she wrote it honestly, telling her aunt where she was and what had happened and what she was doing, and she felt, writing it, a sense of accounting for herself that had been missing for a long time. The letter was answered. Her aunt was not the woman Alice had hoped she might be, but she was alive and she wrote back, briefly and slightly awkwardly, and it was something. November brought cold and the beginning of the long interior life that a Texas winter created for the people who spent it in small towns. The work at the store shifted in character: slower days, longer evenings, more time for the conversations that happened between the two of them in the evenings when the store was closed and the town was quiet. It was on one of these evenings that Calvin went to the back room and came back with the battered volume of poetry she had noticed on his shelf. He set it on the counter between them. "This was my mother's," he said. "She brought it from Tennessee. It is the only thing I have of hers." Alice looked at the cover without touching it. The binding was worn smooth, the gilt lettering on the spine almost entirely gone. "What is it?" "Keats," he said. She liked Keats. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an openness that was unusual even for him, the look of a person who is showing you something they do not show everyone. She understood the significance of it. She picked up the book carefully and held it with the same care. "Read me something," she said. He paused. Then he took the book back, found a page by memory rather than by searching, and read to her from it. His voice was low and even, and the words were old and full of beauty, and the store was warm and lamplit, and outside the November cold was pressing against the glass, and she sat across from him and listened with everything she had. When he finished, she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother had good taste." "She did," he said. "Tell me something else about her," Alice said. So he did. And she told him more about her father. They sat in the lamplight and traded pieces of the people they had come from, and it felt like the most intimate thing she had ever done with anyone, more intimate in some ways than any other kind of closeness, because it was about the roots of a person rather than the surface. The following week, Calvin asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon. It was a Sunday when the store was closed and the town was quiet, and they walked along the bank of Crestfall Creek in the thin winter sunlight, and she knew before it happened that it was going to happen. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The creek was low and clear, making its small, persistent sound over the stones. He turned to face her. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something she had not expected, not a ring, but a small piece of hammered silver that he had made by the smith in the next town. A simple bracelet, carefully made, without ornamentation except for a small pattern along the edge that she would later recognize as the same pattern that was worn into the spine of his mother's book of Keats. "I am not doing this the way I have seen other men do it," he said. "I am not going to make a speech or make it a performance. I do not have the words for a speech." He paused. "What I have is this. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want you to stay not because there is a job or a debt or any reason constructed from practicality. I want you to stay because I love you and because I believe we are good for each other and because I think we could build something here that would be worth something." He held the bracelet out to her. "So, will you?" She looked at him and felt the full weight of everything she had carried since April: the debt, the grief, the long ride, the fear, the slow and genuine falling into a new life, All of it gathered into this moment. She felt the truth of it, all of it at once. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put the bracelet on her wrist. She looked down at the silver against her skin in the winter light and felt it like a promise made from something real. They were married in January of 1881 in the small church in Crestfall that had recently acquired a new pastor, a young man named Reverend Hale, who was still finding his footing in the town, but who performed the ceremony with genuine care. The church was full, because Crestfall was a small town and Calvin was well liked, and Alice had in the 9 months since her arrival become someone that people knew and trusted. Elspeth Dunbar was in the front row and cried, which she would have denied if anyone mentioned it. Ed Doran and his wife Margaret stood up with them. It was a cold day, clear and bright, with a sky so blue it looked painted. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from the best fabric in the store, a deep blue that matched the sky outside, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers that Margaret Doran had brought from her own supply, because she said every woman should have something living in her hands on her wedding day, even if the living had been preserved. Alice walked down the aisle of the small church alone because there was no one to walk her down, and she did not find this sad. She found it right. She had come this far under her own power, and she arrived at this moment under her own power, and what waited at the end of the aisle was not rescue but a person, a specific and irreplaceable person, who had made space for her to be exactly who she was. Calvin watched her walk toward him with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not overwhelmed, not performative, simply present, simply a man seeing the thing he had been hoping for arrive, and receiving it with everything he had. Reverend Hale read from the usual words, and they said the usual vows. And when Calvin put the ring on her finger, she felt the silver bracelet on her wrist and thought about his mother, and about her father, and about the strange, winding roads that had brought two people from Tennessee and the Texas Panhandle to a small bend in a not very impressive creek in 1881. Outside the church, in the cold winter light, the town gathered around them with the natural warmth of a small community claiming a new thing as its own. There was food at the boarding house Mrs. Nell Cooper, who ran the place, had outdone herself, and there was a fiddle player who set up in the corner, and there was dancing, which Alice had not expected and which delighted her. She danced with Calvin, who was not a particularly skilled dancer and who said so plainly when she raised an eyebrow at his footing, and she laughed, and he laughed at her laughing, and they danced badly and happily in the warm room while Crestfall celebrated around them. Spring came early that year. February brought warm rains instead of cold, and the creek ran fuller than it had in several years, and there was a quality to the air in March. She noticed it on the anniversary of her father's death, standing at the edge of the creek in the early morning, 1 year to the day from when he had died. That was both sad and full of promise. She held both things at once. She had learned over the past year that this was possible, that sadness and hope were not opposites but could live in the same moment, and that the capacity to hold both was what allowed you to keep going. She told Calvin about the anniversary when she came back inside. They were in the small room behind the store that had become their domestic space, where she had hung curtains and put up shelves and made it something different from what it had been. He held her without speaking, and she let herself be held, and that was enough. By April, she knew she was pregnant. She told him on a Wednesday morning before the store opened, with the same directness she brought to all important things. She said, "I think we are going to have a child," and she watched the information move through him like water through dry ground. He said, "Are you sure?" she said. "I am fairly sure, yes. I will go to see Dr. Cole to confirm it." He was quiet for a moment with an expression she could not read, and then he looked at her with something so full that it could not entirely contain itself, and she understood that it was complete, uncomplicated joy, the kind that a person who has had a lot of difficulty does not always expect to feel, and therefore feels with particular force when it arrives. "All right," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "All right." She saw Dr. Cole that afternoon. He confirmed what she already knew. She was approximately 10 weeks along, which meant the baby would arrive in October, which felt fitting to her in some way she could not entirely explain. October, the beautiful month, the month that had felt like a reward after summer. The spring and summer of 1881 were busy with the business of the store and the slow, astonishing business of growing a person. Alice continued to work, which she had no intention of stopping, and the regulars of the store adjusted to her changing shape with the matter-of-fact acceptance of people who lived close to the rhythms of life and death and birth. Mrs. Pryor brought her a jar of preserved peaches and told her to eat them. Rosa Hernandez arrived one afternoon with advice that Alice received gratefully and honestly. Elspeth Dunbar made a quilt. Calvin was attentive in the way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. Not hovering, not anxious, not performing concern, but genuinely present. He moved things without being asked when the lifting became inadvisable. He woke in the night when she woke without making her feel guilty for waking him. He asked Dr. Cole careful, informed questions that showed he had been thinking about this thoroughly, and he incorporated the answers into how he managed the days. He also spent time in the evenings on a project she watched accumulate in the space behind the store, a crib, built from the good pine lumber they stocked, with a smoothness to the finishing work that cost him several evenings of careful effort. She watched him work on it and felt the same thing she had felt in the first weeks, the recognition of a person who does things quietly and well, who puts thought and care into what he makes. August brought heat again, and September brought the restless weight of late pregnancy, and October, the beautiful October, the rewarding October, brought 3 days of early labor, and then, on the 15th of the month with Dr. Cole and Margaret Doran in attendance and Calvin in the next room doing what men of that era did in those situations, which was be available and try not to come apart entirely, the first child of Alice and Calvin Hawkins entered the world. It was a boy. He was red-faced and loud and perfect, and Alice held him in the lamplight with the October wind against the windows, and felt something happen to her that she did not have words for and did not need words for. A fundamental reorganization of the interior architecture of herself around this new and enormous fact. Calvin came in when Margaret called for him, and he stood at the bedside and looked at his son with the same quality of expression he had worn in the church in January, that particular completeness, that receiving of the hoped-for thing. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy and then at Alice, and Alice saw his eyes were bright. "He looks angry," Calvin said. "He was comfortable," Alice said. "We interrupted him." "What shall we call him?" Calvin asked. She had thought about this. She said, "Thomas, after my father." Calvin looked at her. He said quietly, "Thomas Hawkins." "Yes," she said, "if that is all right." "It is more than all right," he said. He reached out and touched the baby's small hand with one finger, with the careful precision of a man who is very aware of the fragility of what he is touching. The baby's fingers curled around his with the blind instinct of the newborn. Calvin went entirely still. Alice watched this and felt the grief for her father and the joy of her son and the love for the man beside her all at once, all in the same space, all completely real and completely present, and she held all of it. Thomas Garrison Hawkins grew at the rate that babies grow, which is to say with a speed that astonishes everyone who watches it close up. He was a serious baby who studied the world with large, dark eyes that were clearly going to be his father's eyes, and a stubbornness that Alice recognized as her own contribution, and a tendency to be thoroughly satisfied when being carried and thoroughly unhappy when set down, which she suspected would remain characteristic. He slept in the crib Calvin had made, and he grew, and the store went on around him as he grew, and Crestfall went on around the store, and the seasons turned. The winter of 1881 going into 1882 was the hardest winter Crestfall had seen in a decade. The cold came in early November and did not relent until March, and there were weeks of icy winds that kept people close to their fires, and brought real hardship to the families on the outlying ranches and farms. Calvin opened a line of extended credit that winter that he would not call charity, but that functioned as a lifeline for several families. And Alice managed the accounts with a care that kept the store viable while maximizing what they could absorb. It was difficult and precise and important work, and she did it with the sense of purpose that had always been her strongest quality, the sense that the work mattered, that the details mattered, that the numbers in the ledger represented real people and real lives. In January, during a stretch of particularly brutal cold, a woman knocked at the door of the store at 7 in the evening, well after closing time. She had a child with her, a boy of perhaps 5 years, and she was clearly in some distress, though she was trying to manage that distress with a dignity that Alice immediately recognized, because she had spent years wearing a similar expression herself. Her name was Clara Bayard. Her husband had left in October and had not returned. She had run out of firewood and had almost run out of food, and she had walked into town from a place that was 2 miles distant in the cold, with the child on her hip for part of it. Alice brought them inside. She heated food and she sat the child, whose name was Sam, by the stove with Thomas's collection of wooden toys, and she and Calvin worked out with Clara Bayard a practical arrangement for the winter that involved firewood and food, and a credit account that they would work out the terms of later when the immediate crisis had passed. Clara Bayard sat at the counter and drank hot coffee and let herself accept help, which was clearly difficult for her, and Alice understood that difficulty completely. She did not make it easier by making it large. She made it easier by making it practical and specific, and about the next week rather than the big abstract category of need, which was what you did, she had learned when you were dealing with a person's pride. After Clara and Sam had left with firewood arranged and a plan in place, Alice stood at the window of the store and watched them go. She felt Calvin come to stand beside her. "We cannot save everyone," he said, not as a discouragement but as a truth being named. "No," she said, "but we can do what is in front of us." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the cold pressed against the glass, and inside the store it was warm. Clara Bayard paid back every cent by the following autumn, which Alice had suspected she would. She was that kind of woman. The years moved the way years do in a life that has found its right shape with a fullness that makes time feel well used even as it passes quickly. The store grew. Alice's reorganization and accounting practices had created enough margin by 1883 that Calvin was able to make improvements: a proper loading dock at the back, a better storage system for the perishables, a second counter that allowed 2 customers to be served simultaneously during the busy harvest season. Crestfall grew too, slowly, the way small towns grow when the land is not hostile to them, with new families arriving and new buildings going up on the edge of the main street. Alice became, in the way that happens in small communities, someone people came to. Not officially, not with any title or appointment, but women came to her. Women in difficult situations, women with problems they could not name out loud to the men in their lives, women who needed someone to talk to who would listen without judgment and think practically about what was possible. She had not sought this role, but she had the qualities it required: the ability to listen, the ability to think clearly under the pressure of emotion, the knowledge that had come from her own life of how quickly circumstances could shift, and how much it mattered when someone was steady when you were not. In 1883, she quietly, at her own expense, began setting aside a small fund that she did not name and did not keep in the main store ledger. She told Calvin about it because she told Calvin everything, and he looked at the numbers she showed him and said, "What is this for?" "For when someone needs something and cannot ask for it in the regular way," she said. "A woman with children and no man, a family that has hit a wall they cannot get past on their own." She paused. "I was that person. I know what it is to need a way out of a situation that is built like a trap, and I know that 43 miles of red dust and a ledger full of a dead man's debts is not always what it takes. Sometimes it is just $40 and someone who knows what to do with them. Calvin looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "I will match what you put in." She looked at him. "You do not have to do that." "I am aware," he said, "of things I do not have to do." He picked up the pen. "How much did you have in there?" she told him. He doubled it right then and wrote it in the secondary ledger she had created for it, and that was that. By 1884, there were 2 additional members of the Hawkins household. A girl, Eleanor, who arrived in the summer of 1883 with her mother's stubbornness and her father's dark eyes, and a quantity of opinions for a 1-year-old that suggested she was going to be thorough in her selfhood. And in the spring of 1884, Alice was certain again, and they were going to have a third. "You know," Calvin said one evening in May, with Thomas on his knee and Eleanor pulling at the hem of his coat with determination and Alice watching all 3 of them from across the room, "the building next door has been empty since Harlan moved his leather shop to the new road." "I know," Alice said. She had been watching it too. "We could expand," he said. "Larger dry goods section, or hardware." "The town needs hardware properly." "We could do hardware and dry goods," she said, "if we managed it right." "We would need help," he said. "One more person at least." She thought about Clara Byad's eldest son, who was 15 now and reliable, and had been asking Calvin quietly whether there might be work at the store. She mentioned this. Calvin considered it for exactly as long as the consideration required. "I will talk to him Monday," Calvin said. "I will start the figures for the expansion tomorrow," Alice said. Thomas, apparently feeling that the adult conversation had gone on long enough, said with great authority from his father's knee, "I want to go see the horses." "Later," Calvin said. "Now," Thomas said, with an inflection that came so clearly from his mother that both of them registered it simultaneously, and looked at each other and both, in the same moment, tried not to smile and failed. The expansion of the store took place in the autumn of 1884, when Alice was in the late stages of her 3rd pregnancy, and perhaps not supposed to be supervising the construction of the interior fixtures, but was doing so anyway, because someone had to make sure the shelving was properly anchored, and the floor plan made sense for the workflow. Calvin said nothing about this except to make sure she was not doing any heavy lifting, which she was not, and to bring her water regularly, which she accepted. The 3rd child was a boy, born in November, and they called him James, for Calvin's father. He was a different baby from Thomas, easier, more placid, interested in everything with a gentle curiosity that showed itself early and seemed to be simply who he was. Thomas, now 3, received his brother with a mixture of suspicion and fascination that resolved, over several months, into a proprietorial affection. Eleanor, at 1.5, was indifferent to James in the specific way of second children who have their own social agenda to manage. The new hardware section of the store opened in December, in time for the winter preparations, and was a success from its first week. Jack Byad, Clara's son, turned out to be exactly as reliable as Alice had predicted, with a natural head for practical things and a manner with customers that Calvin said reminded him of Alice when she had first started, which Alice did not know whether to take as a compliment, and eventually decided it was one. 1885 passed with the satisfying continuity of a life that has found its rhythm. The town continued to grow around them. The children grew with the relentless industry of children. Thomas started school at the schoolhouse that had been built the previous year, and came home every day full of information that he delivered to the family, with the intensity of someone who has recently discovered that the world contains more than he had previously understood. Eleanor, at 2, was developing a personality of such confident distinctiveness that even strangers noticed it, and Alice watched her sometimes with a mixture of recognition and awe. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Alice and Calvin sat together in the warm room behind the store, and sometimes he read to her from his mother's Keats, and sometimes they talked about the day or the future or the people in their lives, and sometimes they sat in a comfortable silence that was its own kind of conversation. He had long since stopped being the spare, careful man she had first met across the counter. Or perhaps he was still exactly that man, and she had simply come to understand the depth and richness that lived inside that quietness. She thought sometimes about the ride she had taken in April of 1880, through the red dust and the heat, carrying her father's ledger. She thought about what she had been carrying then, not just the ledger but everything. The grief, the obligation, the fear, the stubborn determination to settle what was owed and then figure out what came after. She thought about the ledger hitting the counter in Calvin's store, the sound of it like a gunshot, and the silence that had followed. She thought about him saying the debt is forgiven 2 years ago, and the way the floor had shifted under her. She thought about water in a glass, about a plate of food set down without comment, about a hand placed over hers with the care of someone handling something valuable, about a silver bracelet with a pattern from the spine of a book of poems, about all the small and enormous ways that a person could create a reason for you to stay when the reason you came had been taken away. She thought about her father, who had always meant to pay what he owed and never had, and who had been loved anyway by a man who wrote the debt off in a ledger, and never mentioned it because he knew the argument that would have followed. She thought about the particular kindness of that, the way it had rippled forward through time into her life in a way Thomas Garrison could never have predicted. She missed him every day. She had stopped missing him in the acute, cutting way of early grief and had moved into the longer, softer grief of someone who is gone for good but whose presence can still be felt in the things you carry from them. Her father lived in her accounting and in her stubbornness and in the way she read people and in the way she had raised her children to understand that fairness was not optional. One evening in the spring of 1886, sitting in the lamplight while Calvin read and James was asleep and the older two were in their beds, Alice looked up from the sock she was mending and said, "I need to go back to Amarillo at some point." Calvin looked up from the book. "To the grave," he said. Yes, she had not been back since she left. She had been sending money to the cemetery caretaker for the maintenance of the plot. "I need to go and stand there properly. I have not done that." "We can go in the summer," he said. "Take the children." She looked at him. "You do not have to come." "I know I do not have to come," he said, with the gentle, familiar echo of all the times they had had versions of this exchange. They went in July, when the store could be left with Jack Byad and his mother for a week. They made the trip by wagon, because 3 children under 6 could not be managed on horseback over 43 miles. Thomas thought the journey was a considerable adventure. Eleanor was interested in everything. James slept through most of it in his mother's arms. Alice stood at her father's grave on a July morning with Calvin beside her, and the children occupied nearby under the supervision of an elderly neighbor woman who had known Thomas Garrison and who had wept when she saw Alice. She stood there and said what she had been saving to say for 6 years, the accounting of it, the thank you and the grief and the pride and the peace, all of it. She told him about Calvin. She told him about Thomas and Eleanor and James. She told him about the store and the town and the life that had been built from the ruins of a bad spring and a long ride and a debt that turned out not to exist. She told him that she was happy, which was the truest and most important thing. Calvin did not say anything while she talked. He stood beside her with the solid, present quiet that was his most fundamental quality. And she was grateful for him in the particular way that you are grateful for a thing when you feel its full weight and its full value all at once. On the way back, on the second morning, they stopped at the top of a long rise that looked back over the country they had come through, red and gold and enormous. The Texas sky above it so vast and so blue that it seemed like more sky than the world had a right to. And Alice looked at all of it with a feeling she could not have named at 26 and could name now easily. Gratitude. Clear, simple, uncomplicated gratitude for the fact of being alive in this particular life. Thomas tugged at her skirt. "Mama," he said, "are we going home now?" She looked down at him, at his dark Hawkins eyes and her own stubborn set of chin, and she said, "Yes, we are going home." They arrived back in Crestfall on a Thursday afternoon, and the town received them with the easiness of something receiving what belongs to it. The store was in good order. Jack Byatt had managed 2 minor crises with competence. There were orders waiting and accounts to reconcile, and the quotidian ongoing business of a life that had found its right shape. Alice walked through the store in the late afternoon light, touching the shelves she had reorganized 6 years ago, running her hand along the counter where she had set down her father's ledger with a sound like a gunshot, and a heart full of obligation and grief. She stood behind the counter and looked at the store, the expanded store, the thriving store, the store that had become the center of something that sustained a whole community, and she felt the full continuity of it. Calvin came in from the back, Thomas on his heels, and he stopped when he saw her standing there, and he looked at her with that expression she had cataloged the first time she saw it and had been living inside ever since. That expression that was not quite a smile but was everything behind a smile. "You all right?" he said. "More than all right," she said. He came around the counter and stood beside her, and they looked together at the store and the street beyond the window and the particular quality of late afternoon Texas light that turned everything to gold. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me. The schoolhouse needs books. It has the building and the teacher, but the library is nearly empty. I looked at it on the way through yesterday." She had noted this and filed it away. "I think we could arrange something. Talk to the town council, organize a collection." Calvin considered this. "That is a project," he said. "It is," she agreed. "We have several projects already." "We do," she said. "One more will not kill us." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. Then he said, "I will write to the printer in San Antonio about discounts for bulk orders." "And I will talk to Elspeth Dunbar," Alice said. "She knows everyone who might donate." "She does," he agreed. They stood together in the golden light with their children's voices audible from the back of the store, and the town turning through its late afternoon business outside the window, and the ledger on the counter waiting with its patient columns of numbers. And Alice felt, in the particular, settled, undeceived way that is different from early happiness. That is the happiness of a life fully inhabited completely and permanently at home. She had come here to repay a debt. The debt had been forgiven before she arrived, quietly and without ceremony, by a man who thought fair thoughts and acted on them without needing to be seen doing it. He had forgiven the debt, and then, without making a production of it, had made a place for her to stay. He had offered her honest work and a fair wage and a room with a window over the street, and the slow, genuine unfolding of a life that had more room in it than she had imagined a life could have. She had stayed. She had stayed because the work was real and the town needed what she could give it, and because her small room above the store had begun, by degrees, to feel like something worth staying for. She had stayed because of lamplight evenings and ledger columns and a plate of food set down without comment and a hand placed carefully over hers. She had stayed because grief and hope had met each other in this place and decided to coexist. She had stayed because the silver bracelet with the pattern from the spine of a book of poems was as good a reason as any. She had stayed in the end because this was where she belonged, and she had recognized belonging when she found it, even though she had not been looking for it, even though she had come looking for something entirely different. Outside, the sun finished its descent, and the first lamp was lit in the window of the boarding house across the street. Thomas ran through from the back calling for his father about something urgent. Eleanor's voice rose in one of her characteristic declarations. James was surely asleep, wherever he had settled in the back room. Calvin went to see what Thomas needed, and Alice stayed at the counter for one more moment, alone, her hand resting on the ledger, looking at the street she knew by heart. Then she smiled, took her hand off the ledger, and went to find her family.